Good afternoon and good evening. Thank you for joining us from many different time zones for this special lecture, part of the ongoing series from the National Library of Israel Reading Room. The Reading Room is an analyzed virtual culture platform and offers a wide range of fascinating events. We have recently expanded with more English language sessions, and so be sure to check out the Reading Room platform so that you are updated about the ongoing series. I'm pleased to introduce internationally acclaimed photographer Frederick Brenner, who will speak to you this afternoon. Frederick's first photographic essay was a study of Mea Shearim, published as a monograph in 1984. He realized he was witnessing diaspora being recreated in the heart of Israel. This inspired in him a desire to seek out Jewish diaspora around the world. French by birth and trained as a social anthropologist at the Sorbonne, his camera became a tool to record and preserve for history the variety of Jewish life at the end of the 20th century, knowing that much of what he was seeing was on the verge of extinction. Portraits are his medium, but everywhere he went, he tried to record Jewish communal life as thoroughly as he could. The streets and the houses where Jews lived, the professions in which they worked, the religious life. A large part of his photographs from 25 years in which he visited over 40 countries was documentary, but documents created by an artist. A selection of his work was eventually published in 2003 as Diaspora Homelands in Exile. Brenner's next major project, This Place, which he initiated and directed, was a group effort in which he invited 11 world-renowned photographers from many backgrounds to join him in encountering Israel and the West Bank, its place and metaphor, challenging them to look beyond the headlines and into the fault lines. This place was shown in museums in Israel, Europe, and the United States. He is now working on his next book on the politics of Jewish identity in Berlin today. He lived between Europe and Jerusalem. I am pleased to announce that we are hoping to bring the Frederick Brenner collection, his photographs and journals, to join the National Library of Israel collection. It is our mission to collect, preserve, and offer access to the social, cultural, and intellectual history of Israel and Jewish people worldwide. Frederick's work beautifully captures and reflects this mission. Please welcome my friend Frederick Brenner.
Mr. Brenner, you're on mute. Mr. Brenner, you have to, unmute yourself, please. There you go.
Is it unmute? Sorry. I was just saying that I first thank you, Oren, for your introduction, and thank you for your invitation today. The main challenge for me is to speak to an invisible audience, and of course it was mute for the beginning, but I shall try. When the visible is being fetishized and the invisible sacrificed, the world certainly doesn't need any more images unless photographs can challenge our views, open a crack in what we think we know. If our knowledge, what we think we know, has led us to this overburdened world on the brink of catastrophe, how do we stay clear-sighted, clear-headed, and most of all, clear-hearted? In the midst of such confusion, what can I contribute as a photographer? At each step of my journey, I have tried to formulate the stakes at the core of my endeavor. I have again and again revisited my intentions in light of the outcome. There were always more questions than answers. Now, at this phase of my quest, I'm thinking about the architecture of my work as a whole, how to stage this photographic harvest so that it can convey the main vectors which guided me and the even more important ones which were revealed to me in the process. Because ultimately, this photographic harvest must become an archive to be mined now and in the future, so that viewers can drive to the heart of every answer and expose the question the answer hides, to quote James Baldwin. I now see clearly that the overall arch of my work is an invitation to embrace otherness. If it started with an intuition and an inner call that led me on a 40-year journey to over 45 countries, I have to admit that it was largely a subconscious drive. This journey undertook me rather than I undertook it. As the contour of the portrait I was drawing started to emerge, it became more and more obvious that my initial intention to create a visual record of the Jewish people in modern times led me to address questions about the human condition. It simultaneously morphed into an auto-portrait reflecting all the rifts and paradoxes of my human condition. From Samarkand to Calcutta, Sarajevo to Beijing, Tangier to Rome, and from New York to Berlin, the further I went, the closer I was getting to myself. A journey of restitution to a history, my history, unspoken, buried, dissimulated, forgotten, overcome, in order to finally embrace my own path, a path that leads to intimacy, to know thyself. And photographic practice exposed me to intimacy. In the words of the iconic American photographer Edward Weston, what could be more intimate than the close-up study of an object, or being in absolute accord with someone's emotion when working on a portrait? Driven to save and rescue from oblivion visual fragments of a history, both one and plural, almost addicted to documenting every possible sample of Jewish acculturation and survival everywhere on the planet, this photographic, ethnographic, sociologic, and historic survey became the prologue to a journey of self-discovery. With my camera as a tool, I've been retrieving the many threads which weave the complexity of who I am, rescuing many of my ignored, despised, abandoned selves. The original outward movement to portray the fragments of a large diaspora jigsaw puzzle led to the discovery of an emotional geography, to an inward movement, from macrocosm to microcosm, and back again, from the particular to the universal, and back again. As I was mapping the diaspora of my people, it became clear that this journey of self-exploration through diaspora was in fact a journey of exploration of the diaspora within, an inner geography of my many selves. Each one is various, many, an overflow of selves. In the outstretched colony of our being, people of all kinds exist who think and feel in various ways, says the poet Fernando Pessoa. Today, revisiting the title I chose for my books, I see an itinerary of restitution. So to start with, Instance of Eternity, my first book, I see my young self with a romantic longing for harmony and shlemut, or wholeness, unaware of the real life of the people I was photographing, and equally unaware of what was going on inside myself. Diaspora, homelands in exile, starting to question what is home and what is exile. And then exile at home, while acknowledging fault lines and scars in the human landscape, the work started to mirror one of the most conflicted times in my life. An archaeology of fear and desire. Yes, an archaeology of my fear and my desire as reflected in the intensity and paradoxes of Israel today. And then my upcoming book, Zerheilt, or Healed to Pieces, a word invented by poet Paul Celan, which deal with fragmentation, disintegration, and longing to be healed. It takes place in Berlin today, as I've tried to make sense of this phase of my journey for this lecture. And for myself, I haven't found anything better than the words of the Sufi poet from the 13th century, Jalal-ad-Din Mohammed Rumi, who says, "Don't turn your head, look at the bandage place. This is where the light enters you. And don't think for a moment that you are healing yourself." By trying to connect dots, the dots now seem to be connecting me. In fact, they have been connecting me since the very beginning. All along, since the beginning of my journey, the injunction to Abraham resonates. Lech lecha, go forth, leave your land, your kindred, the house of your father, and go to the place I will give you to see. And the place is never named, as if it belongs to us to name it, as we are going there. Lech lecha, go for you, go to yourself, go with yourself, go within yourself. The land I will give you to see. The land is about an inner space, an inner place, not only a territory. It is about another field of consciousness, which has to be stretched and experienced in order to acknowledge, to accept, to embrace. And I wrestled for years before I dared to embrace the non-familiar, the unknown, the strange, and the stranger within. To dare to be estranged rather than hold on to fictions, narratives that we have carved to bridge the unbearable, dissonant, ever-changing reality, inside, outside, the fragments which can never reconcile. This is what my photographic practice has led me to. We need to recognize that we are multiple within ourselves, strangers even to ourselves. This is the ultimate promise and the only possible redemption. There is no redemption other than embracing our own plurality, the selves that may be hostile, contradictory, exclusive, strong, vulnerable, enigmatic, mysterious. Montaigne, the great essayist, who himself lived through a plague in the 16th century, said, "We are all lumps, so various and shapeless in texture, that every piece plays at every moment its own game, and there is as much difference between us and ourselves as between us and the other." If this journey had not led me closer to myself, to more intimacy with the unknown, with my difference, with my fears, to the point of embracing otherness, this journey would have been in vain. It was out of a deep necessity that I couldn't name then, but that I couldn't renounce either, that I answered this mysterious inner call and went everywhere on the planet to create a portrait of my people. I had a naive, loving notion of the Jewish people and longed to show its unity and wholeness. But the more I was looking, searching for a common thread, the more I was forced to recognize the discontinuity among the vast spectrum of expression of Jews and Judaism. What do all these people have in common but their differences and the way they relate to these differences? If I hadn't been a photographer, I may never have started to question the intricacies of identity. I was prompted to do so because, as a portraitist, I had to explore how to represent a human being, to deconstruct the image of the Jew in what began to appear to me as a performance of identity. For decades, at each stage of my journey, I've been wrestling with questions regarding the photographic form which could reveal the large typology of acculturations I encountered. The challenge was to reinvent a form appropriate to the specificity of each community, scattered as they were on the entire spectrum of time and space over 4 continents, from tribal to postmodern, from medieval to industrial, still coexisting in contemporary time, a rare opportunity. While I was originally motivated to save from oblivion antique forms of acculturation on the verge of extinction in Morocco, India, Yemen, Central Asia, among other countries, these Oriental forms of acculturation were easily identifiable visually. But as the puzzle was taking shape in front of my eyes, my interest moved to the West, America and Europe, where the increasing fluidity and fragmentation of the ethno-racial landscape and the proliferation of crossover forms of racial, gender, and religious identification obliged me to think in a broader and eventually more fruitful way about the complexities, tensions, and contradictions in the contemporary politics of identity. The expanding empire of choice in identity has provoked anxieties about the destabilization of the cognitive, social, and moral order. In a time of unsettled identities, an opportunity is offered to us to look at identities for what they are, fictions. Identities seem to us real because they have been hammered long enough that we think they are solid and unquestionable. It is only now, in my most recent work, that I'm confronting the opportunity this offers me as a Jew and as a human being. The collapsing and blurring of all categories is an invitation to revisit and question culturally consecrated constructs to which we have been holding on and which have been holding on to us, and to free ourselves. Perhaps it's now time to look at some photographs. So I hope we are coordinating that with Moria in Jerusalem, who is kind enough to go through the photograph, which I didn't dare to go through. Yes, and I want to, okay, very good. And so Moria will go with the first photograph. Yes, yes, I was expecting. I've kind of, yes, maybe I can see the photograph. Yes, this is very good. So everything started in Jerusalem. I was 18. I had never been in Israel before, and I had never felt a special attraction for photography either. But I was truly enchanted by Jerusalem and the neighborhood of Mea Shearim, by this timeless choreography in this little enclave, this Chateau in the heart of the Middle East. In other terms, diaspora in the heart of Jerusalem. Jacques Derrida, who wrote about these photographs, say that Mea Shearim is the key of diaspora. It remains outside home, at home. And this became, and Mea Shearim became the matrix of my entire project, which then led me to over 45 countries. And this is my very first photograph, Purim in Jerusalem. In the next photograph, we could very well be in Poland or somewhere in Eastern Europe 100 years ago under a sukkah. The next photograph, we are very far from Jerusalem. We are in Birobidzhan, in the far east of the former Soviet Union, a 9 hours flight from Moscow to give you an idea of where you are on the map, 1 hour from Tokyo. We are in the Jewish autonomous region of the Soviet Union, an idea of Stalin in the 30s, early 30s, where Jews from around the world, not only from Russia and other republics, but also from Argentina, France, America, came to settle and create a Jewish state 20 years before the creation of the State of Israel. Here in the middle of the taiga, at the border of China, below 40 centigrades in winter, plus 40 centigrades in summer, I think Jews have never been afraid of such experiments in utopia. Doesn't such inclination, in fact, define who we are? Next photograph. We are in Ilyinka, Russia, a kolkhoz or a collective farm, the place, in fact, where Natan Sharansky was arrested while encouraging this community known under the name of Subutnik Gerims to emigrate to Israel. This family, like most others, emigrated to Israel a few years later and live today in Bet Shemesh. And I think I chose this photograph because it seems we are out of a Dostoevsky novel. We are not yet in Soviet Union, but more under the Tsarist regime. And if you look above the bed, you see a portrait of the grandfather, which looks more like an icon. In the next photograph, we are in Bukhara, the night of Hoshana Rabbah, in the synagogue. And as you know, there's a tradition to study all night. So I went for the first time to the former Soviet Union in 1982, when the perestroika didn't even start. I was one of the very first Western photographers to then negotiate and obtain a permission to travel in the 14 republics out of the 15 republics of the Soviet Union. And I wanted to really show the incredible ethnic and cultural diversity within this territory, while we had a very monolithic perception of what was Soviet Union. And there were basically in former Soviet Union 4 main distinct Jewish communities. Ashkenazim, who lived, between Russia, Belarus, Ukraine. And then you had 3 other very important communities. The community of Jews who lived in Central Asia, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, called Bukharsky Evreyi, Bukharian Jews. Then you had Jews from Georgia, Gruzinsky Evreyi, and then you have mountain Jews, Gorsky Evreyi. And what is amazing is that the 3 other communities, apart from white Ashkenazim, were able to retain their specific identity in republics where, in fact, Islam was prevailing. And the Jews just got the benefit of what the Muslim population was enjoying because of the fear of the central government regarding potential Muslim fundamentalism. What is beautiful in this photograph is that you see there's hardly any books on the table. You have maybe 4 elders who still know how to read, but people are still present. It's past midnight, and we are in the synagogue of Bukhara. The next photograph, we are in the Caucasus, in the town of Rabba, Azerbaijan, very famous for its rugs, along the Caspian Sea. Among one of these 4 groups that I described previously, the famous Gorsky Evreyi, mountain Jews, were able to retain their specific identity by finding refuge in the mountains very close from the seashore. And we are now in a chaykhana, a tea room. Tea is a religion in Azerbaijan, all along the Caucasus and even in Central Asia. In fact, this small place called Krasnaya Sloboda, which is, I would say, the Jewish town, which is geographically on a lower level than the Muslim town of Kumba. And I wanted to portray the life in a village, in 1983, when I went for the first time to Kuba, people were basically practicing Judaism. I was there in several occasions, and they spoke a Judeo-Persian dialect. And this is a community who have survived, as many others, on margin of history, on the margin of our memory. About 200,000 people lived along the Caspian Sea between Baku and Makhachkala, and they created poetry, music, theater. They had their own Judeo-Persian language, as I said, and I wanted to put a face on this way of remaining a Jew, of remaining a man, a woman, under this sky, but also under so many skies. In the next photograph, we are in Leninabad. I don't see many people on the side, but I see the smile of some people that I know. We are in Leninabad, Tajikistan, not far from the Afghan border, and we are in a Jewish hairdresser saloon. All barbers are Jews, all customers are Muslim Tajiks. And when Mark Twain says, Jews are just like everybody else, only more so, I think this is what this photograph is just about. And this is what the overall project is about. I mean, I photographed later on, I traced back 15 families in 1998 for the 50th anniversary of Israel. And the photograph is like a diptych in Tajikistan or in Yemen or and then in Israel. And I traced back all the barbers. Of course, the customers are Muslim Tajiks, so they stay there. But I have the same photograph, all those barbers floating in the Dead Sea. In the next photograph, we are in Ethiopia, more exactly in the Simien Mountains, close to Eritrea. And when I see this photograph, I say, was I really there? It's, you know, they look like living fossil, it's so sculptural, and they are the contemporary of so many other people that you have seen and that you will see in the coming photographs. I was interested to photograph this community just before they were airlifted to Israel, the first airlift. And because this is a community which had retained pre-Talmudic practices, which have disappeared from the rest of the Jewish world. And the next photograph, sorry. We are in Haidan, Yemen, in 1983. This is Lewi Faez and his grandfather in his jewelry workshop. And I didn't know that a few years later, there were like basically 800 Jews left in Yemen in 1983 when I went there for the first time. I went 3 times. I spent more or less 6 months in over 40 countries during all these years to try to cover a cycle of life. And but I never thought that those people eventually would emigrate to Israel. So in the next photograph, we are in Rehovot, in the Merkaz Klita, in the integration center, with Lewi, the same little Lewi, who is now 16, his wife, Nadra, who is 14, they were married, he was 12 and she was 10, and their daughter Mazal. And I attended later on the wedding of Mazal, the Brit Milah of her son. We attended a Seder a few years ago with all the families, 5 generations. And so yes, in a way, this is my imaginary family, much easier to deal with than the real family. And then we are here at the border of Saudi Arabia, still in Yemen. And when I look at this photograph, I always think, is the dress made for the architecture or the architecture for the dress? Through my journey, I came to look at diaspora as a metaphor for fertilizing, how we have been fertilized and how we have fertilized in return, how history unfolds to enable us to accomplish this project, this vocation. I never thought of diaspora as a curse. So from Egypt to Babylon, to Spain, to Germany, to name just a few. In the next photograph, we are in Calcutta, India, at the home of Moses Elias, sitting here with his servant. Moses Elias is one of the few survivors of these thriving communities of Jews, mainly merchants from Baghdad and Basra, who settled in India and Burma in the second half of the 19th century, and then immigrated to England, Israel, and the US after the independence of India. So I also look at this project as a game of matryoshkas, those Russian dolls one into the other. So this diaspora within the diaspora within the diaspora. And I've been following several of these diasporas during this long journey. We are in the next photograph in Alibag in India. So another Jewish community, the indigenous community of Bnei Israel, who lives on the coast 2 hours from Mumbai. And the Jews were known as a caste within a system of caste, a caste of oil press man, and the name was Shanwarteli, which means the oil press man who doesn't work on Shabbat. So Shabbat became the signifier of their name. And the other very interesting example, this is the only example maybe with Georgia where Jews never had to suffer any form of anti-Semitism, because who says caste needs the complement, each caste needs the other to exist. So there was not such a thing as anti-Semitism in Alibag. The next photograph, we are in Belmonte, Portugal. Certainly the most extraordinary example of survival. The last existing group of secret Jews or crypto Jews, better known under the name of Marranos. So officially, they were baptized, married, and buried by the priest, a group of 120 people only, who had preserved a double identity with two sets of rituals. And one, in order to fool the Inquisition, but the amazing thing is that they never forgot the one they had borrowed to the one that truly belonged to them. And in order to fool the Inquisition, they had postponed many of the dates of the holidays. And one of the, here we are under their attic during Pesach, but in order to fool the Inquisition, they had postponed the date of Pesach, the celebration of Pesach, a month later. And it is a prescription in the Bible to be able to perform Pesach on Pesach Sheni, the second Passover, if for any reason of Tum'ah, impurity or other reason, you cannot perform it at that time. And it's very interesting that some Rabbanim recently, because of Corona, have been a lot talking about the Pesach Sheni, because they couldn't celebrate it all together. So I never saw that I would have to deal with Pesach Sheni. I celebrated Pesach at Pesach this year, but and for them, you must understand that the secret to which they were obliged because of the Inquisition, only officially abolished in 1835, became the essence of their ritual. It became a ritual within the ritual, to the point that they couldn't even consider an open Judaism. And I met them thanks to my friend and informant, Ignacio Steinhardt, and over a period of 10 years, I went there every year twice to earn their confidence. And I made this photograph and a film that you can see on YouTube, and I promised them that I would only publish this photograph and release the film only with their permission. And a few years later, in the early 90s, in 1994, I think, they joined mainstream Judaism. A rabbi was sent from Israel. So these, and generation of historians from Cecil Roth and others dreamt to put a face on these hidden practices. In the next photograph, when I spent these many months every year in Portugal, I never thought that I would be asked, maybe one of the two only assignments, to portray the roads of escaping of this diaspora who was expelled from Spain and Portugal. I call it Sephardic itineraries, and it brought me to 22 countries. One of the portraits I did was a portrait of Chateau Rabba in Bordeaux, in France, the place where Montaigne, the same Montaigne that I quoted before, whose mother was a Jew, a Marrano, who escaped Portugal, and where former Marranos from Portugal basically escaped to France, and were known as Portuguese, which was then synonymous of Jewish. Portuguese meant Jewish. And there's what you call the Portuguese nation in the southwest of France. Same Portuguese Jews then went to London and then to Brazil. And this photograph illustrates perfectly the process of acculturation, or how Jews take the color and the shape of the culture they live in. In the next photograph, we are in Manaus, Brazil, the Ben Shimol family at the opera. We are Jews in the second half of the 19th century looking for opportunities, business opportunities, left Morocco and went as far as Brazil, first to Belém on the ocean, and then went all the way along the Amazon River up until the Peruvian border of Iquitos, and they settled, they created small communities all the Amazon River. Manaus was one of the biggest. In the next photograph, we are in Salonika, Greece. We know that 93% of the community, a Sephardic community, was basically deported and killed, and I wanted to pay tribute through this photograph to this community. In the next photograph, we are in Rome, in the Campidoglio, the city hall, with Roberto Di Segni, a Jewish peddler that I met on the market while I spent a year at the French Academy at the Villa Medici. And how such a handful of Jews were able to survive for 2,000 years at the heart of Christianity, where basically Christianity was manufactured and exported and not surrender to the temptation of idol worshiping. And these photographs summarize to a certain extent the entire project. This capacity to become the other, the defining other, and still remain oneself. Identity as an ongoing journey between the other and the self, back and forth all the time. And if you look carefully at the photograph, you may be able to see the hammer which carved the face of Roberto Di Segni. In the next photograph, we are not in Egypt, we are in Las Vegas. I went to America to show the most incredible experimental laboratory in history, where Jews reinvented themselves like at no other time, not even during the Hellenistic period. And so this is the Hebrew Academy, the Jewish Day School of Las Vegas. Again, it's about our inclination for dreaming. Yosef dreams and go to Egypt, and Bugsy Siegel create Las Vegas. In the next photograph, we are in Billings, Montana. I don't know if people look at it on their phone or on a screen, how big is the photograph, but the story of Billings, Montana, you hardly have any Jews, you have 40 Jews, and there was an anti-Semitic act in 1993. Somebody threw a stone in a Jewish home and may have killed the son of the Schnitzer family. Anyway, the next day, the sheriff put a full-page ad in the Montana newspaper asking the entire population to display this full-page ad, which was with a photograph of a Chanukia. And and I decided to reenact this by gathering all the inhabitants of town. So, from the sheriff to the cheerleader, to the UPS, to the Native American. And the text printed on this newspaper was saying, "We citizens of Billings will never accept any form of anti-Semitism, bigotry, or racism." And in these towns, unfortunately, up until today, Native Americans are still called mud race. Simon Schama, who wrote a big essay for the book I published, speaks about a reverse pogrom. It's a pogrom about, it's about Jews without a single Jew. The next photograph, we are in the New York Psychoanalytical Society, the Holy of Holy of the Freudians, with 14 of the most famous New York psychoanalysts. Next photograph, we are in Ellis Island with about 40 iconic figures who shaped American culture and white Western culture in the second half of the 20th century. What again do all these icons have in common but their differences and the way they relate to their difference, what they choose to do with it? The next photograph is about Johannesburg. I was walking in the street and saw this ad, "Let me teach your maid Jewish cooking, call Brenda." Reality or fiction? Many of my photographs play, in fact, on this very thin line. But here what is amazing is, I think, why didn't the taxidermist ask me why a Jewish cooking class in my facility? And why Brenda didn't ask me why a Jewish cooking class at a taxidermist of all places? The next photograph, Buenos Aires, Argentina, Matilda Melibowski, one of the many mothers of missing, those madres de desaparecidos, who lost her daughter, who was tortured and murdered under the military dictature between 1976 and 1984, as two other Jewish teenagers and young adults who had the same fate under the dictature, a totally disproportionate number compared to the number of Jews in Argentina. The next photograph, the Great Wall of China, members of the Jewish community of Beijing and Hong Kong for a Purim celebration. I love to organize parties, so I just created a big party after studying the Megillah for 6 months with the members of the community. And while nations define themselves by and through a territory, and if there's a territory, then you need to protect it. And the wall runs on 3,000 miles. And there's another people, the Jews, whose text is their first and foremost territory, which have been able to survive for 2,000 years in diaspora with a portable identity, to use the phrasing of Heinrich Heine. I see that we have little time, and I'm going to go a little faster. The next slide, thank you. The following photographs are part of this place, which is a collective project I initiated in 2008, in which I invited 11 other artists to join me in exploring Israel and the West Bank as place and metaphor, an attempt to look beyond the headlines, deep into the fault lines, to look beyond a dual perspective, for, against, victim, perpetrator, through a poetic approach. And if I had originally planned to photograph it myself, while carving my working hypothesis, it became then clear that Israel is a place of radical otherness and radical dissonance. And if so, I should then invite others in order to question this otherness. And this is what I did. So my own contribution to this place is called An Archaeology of Fear and Desire. I needed to go back to Jerusalem, where I studied 30 years earlier. You saw the little angel. To undertake this time an archaeology, my own archaeology, an archaeology of my many selves. And as any good archaeologist, I needed a working hypothesis in front of this dig. And at the core of my working hypothesis, there's a promise attached to this land from immemorial time for all its inhabitants. And the question I kept asking myself is, what have we done with this promise? What can we do with it? And what can it do with us? And now, few of the photographs that I choose for today. Thank you for the next photograph, Moria. The former Palace Hotel, today the Waldorf Astoria. Maybe the key to look at all the other images. The next photograph. The Weinfeld family, just before Shabbat at home. The dream already dreamt. The next photograph. My eldest daughter, Elior, who emigrated to Israel, or who first went to Israel and then emigrated to Israel about 14 years ago. The next photograph. Near, injured, by an exploding mine during the Lebanon War. The next photograph. Fatih Tor, Midbar Yehuda, Judean desert. But our text is not a book of geography, and if it is, then it should be about an inner geography. Next photograph. Avi Aslan and his family in what is left of the coastal dunes of Israel. In a way, my waiting for Godot. The next photograph. Pnina Leonov, her mother and her daughter, 3 generations of German Jews who emigrated in the late 20s, and you can see the furniture they brought from Germany. The next photograph. Ben Gurion Airport, 3 Hasidim practicing what is called Shmirat Enaim, the protection of the site. And it took me 4 years to get them to accept to make this photograph. And when I said, why do you wear this? Say, we're learning in a yeshiva where we are being told that it's dangerous to see. So they travel around the world with these kind of burqas. The next photograph, Kibbutz Ma'agan Michael. I thought I couldn't have a portrait of Israel without including the kibbutz because of the role this institution has had in the creation of the state. And it's a very long story. I don't have time to, unfortunately, it's about a woman or 4 women who were the last class of in the Batei Yeladim, in the children's house. And I would say my work is always the result of a collaboration, an intimate collaboration. I'm a kind of midwife for the people that I photograph, and they are a midwife for me. The next photograph is Tel Aviv, Ayalon, the day of Yom HaShoah. The next slide, which is the next slide, is the first photograph of my upcoming project. The photograph which convinced me that I may have something to do in Berlin when I was invited by the German government in the fall of 2016. And we can look at this photograph, Moria. The text tattooed on the back of the person is the opening page of Minima Moralia, Reflection from a Mutilated Life. This is Theodor Adorno and his literary and philosophical masterpiece. And this is Carrie Harrison, who wanted to be photographed exactly like that on the German soil. And maybe the first time where I leave all freedom to, usually it's an interaction, and this time I ask people to stage their own photograph. Carrie, whose mother, Lily Palmer, was one of the greatest Jewish actresses before and after the war, and Carrie, whose grandfather was the head of the Jewish hospital in Berlin, and came as many people to Berlin to become the archaeologists of their own history. These photographs remain a riddle for me. And I would like to go to the next photograph, which is the first photograph, because I spoke of the title I chose, or which chose me. This is the first photograph. And again, Moria, the last photograph. If we can look at the previous photograph, Moria, sorry. Unless we cannot go backward. Yes. Very different syntax, but 2 angels. But again, the photograph still remains a riddle for me. That's, I think, what a photograph also should be. So here I am, 40 years later, having gathered my fragments. You have seen today 40 images very quickly out of 100,000 negatives, revisiting my journey again and again in conversation with the fragments, not looking for coherence, not trying to create coherence, more at peace because more intimate with the strange and the stranger, and simultaneously more strange from what then felt more familiar. Isn't it time to start dealing with our fragments, to listen to the polyphony within, to dare to deal with dissonance and this overflow of selves, to embrace the ever-changing reality, inside, outside, to embrace the core law of the universe, to embrace impermanence and therefore difference, our own difference, the difference between us and ourselves. What do I have in common with the Jews? I hardly have anything in common with myself, says Kafka. One cannot live without narrative, without representation and construct, but one has the obligation not to mistake them for what they are not. They are levers and tools to access our humanity, to reflect and spread it in the world. Otherwise, we end up prostrating ourselves in front of fictions, which take the place of the invisible, out of which the visible is woven. We mustn't let our narratives become a straitjacket which suffocates us. We cannot accept to shrink, because when we shrink ourselves, we necessarily end up shrinking, excluding, and eventually sacrificing the other. Identity is an in-between, a permanent becoming, not solid, but always in flux, always reconfiguring, quite unsettling, nothing to hold on to, just the void to lean on, but so profoundly human. This is what my photographic journey has taught me, to pursue a conversation between strangeness and intimacy, to become, as the photographer, an intimate stranger, to quote my friend Alan Berliner. Today, I would like to share with you what I consider the blessing of this journey of self-exploration. The truth is that I welcome the National Library invitation as an opportunity for me to try and articulate what has been incubating for a long time. What architecture shall I give to this photographic harvest, this puzzle, so that the viewer can embrace otherness and with that, walk on her own path? Even as I was creating my work, I asked myself, how do I leave enough space for the viewer to find his own way? In essence, so that these representations continue to watch over absence. The pandemic, which is shaking the very foundation of our certitudes, obliges us, whether we want it or not, to revisit what has led us to the edge of this abyss. What is needed is an awakening of the heart. The mind alone cannot cope. The crisis we are facing result from the erosion of otherness, both in the landscape, in the form of the disappearance of biodiversity, as well as in the human landscape, where pluralism is smothered in favor of ideological conformity. May we create the conditions that will change our pace so that our hearts can open. May we patiently explore and embrace the nothingness and the void, the shadow and the invisible. How else shall we defy gravity and give grace a chance to permeate us? I want to thank again Oren Weinberg and the National Library, and I want to thank the individual funders who stood at my side year after year for the last 40 years and who are enabling me to dream my dream big. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frederick, for this fascinating talk and the opportunity to see again the images in a different environment than your books. Doron, who is producing this event, will now select few of the questions, and we have a few minutes, so if you'll be so kind to answer a few of those.
Of course, I will answer, and I really apologize. I try to concentrate, in 1 hour, 40 years of work. Yes, I'm listening.
Okay.
Hello, thank you. Tamal writes, thank you very much from Cambridge, UK. A question, can Mr. Brenner comment on the difference between the ages of his subjects? How different is it to photograph the young or the old of the various communities? And how does the sense of age sit with his own experience of belonging, connecting to his subjects?
I've had many questions over all these years. I've never had such question, and I don't really know what to make of it. I have basically, I have photographed a very large spectrum of individuals, again, which are all scattered on the entire spectrum of time and space, from tribal to postmodern, through medieval, industrial. And these people are, from children to adults to people in their 60s, in their 80s. And I basically try to photograph a sample of population which was representative of the place where I was going. Very often the sample of population was very reduced, like in Yemen, like communities which were on a stage of mere survival. And I try to document a cycle of life, including all individuals, and, from, all the rite de passage from a Brit Milah to a funeral. And so those people, you know, are, I mean, it's a sample of population which I think is representative. I don't know if I answer properly to the question, but I would be ready, because I'm sure it's frustrating for some people who have questions. I would be ready to answer later on by email to some of these people.
Thank you. Marta asks if you've ever been to Poland, and have you ever photographed Jewish heritage places and Jewish people in Poland?
Yes, I was in Poland, and the photographs appear in my book, Diaspora, Homelands in Exile. And I didn't go to Poland until the last few years of my project. And I was told by a good acquaintance of mine, Yechiel Pupko, in Chicago, you must go to Poland. You must go to Krakow. It's a Hollywood set where Catholic Poles dress up as Jews to perform Jewishness. And it was one of the most incredible. I attended a Purim spiel performed by the children and grandchildren of the accomplice of the perpetrators in 1941. It's too long, but I attended a Purim spiel in this town north of Krakow. No, very close to Białystok, called Tikocin, very famous for the chronicle. I believe that even the Yehudei Tiktin, I believe the archives are even at the National Library. It's a chronicle of life in this village. We have 3 more minutes, so more question.
Gail asks, do you have a sense of how the earlier photos would have been different had you let the subjects stage their own photographs?
Yes, but I would say what the challenge of this project was really to find a form at the measure of what was at stake in this community. Those were traditional communities. In some of the places where I went, for example, Ethiopia, people had never seen a camera. In Yemen also, they had never seen a camera. So I think it was. I think I used the appropriate form in the place. I mean, I'm sure it would be a very interesting experiment. I used, for example, a Polaroid to offer photographs to people who had never seen a photograph before, which was a tool to get access to this community, which was even afraid of the photograph. But it would have been a very interesting experiment. I didn't try it. But in return, I think it was very interesting to ask people who in their everyday life are much more aware of how much their identity is a performance, to ask them to photograph themselves.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Brenner. There was one more question that was for me. If this meeting has been recorded, and I put our website address in the chat room. So if anyone would like to view this session recorded, it will probably be up within 3 to 4 days. There's a few other links for information and a few other things in the chat, so please make sure to take note. Thank you everyone very much. Have a great evening from the National Library of Israel.
Thank you.
Rabba. Thank you, Mr. Brenner.
Oren. Thank you, Doron. Thank you, Moria, and thank you for the participants.
Just one more thing, Frederick. There's a lot of compliments and many messages personal for you in the chat room. So I will send you the chat.
I don't know how to get to the chat room. I'm just totally...
I will send you the transcript later on, and you can make sure to be in touch with everyone.
Okay. Thank you very much to all.
I'm going to open the microphone so that people can thank you personally at this point.
Thank you, Frederick.
Thank you, Frederick.
Thank you, Toby.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate
it. Thank you. Thanks, Frederick, from Mike and Adrian.
Thank you.
Oh, this is so nice, Mike and Adrian.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Hi, Mike and Adrian.
Thank you. Thank you. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Bravo. Bravo. Merci.
Thank you very much.
Well done.
Frederick, good to see you. Thank you very much for including us.
Wow, very nice. Very nice to see you. Virginia and Robert. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Merci, Frédéric. Merci.
De rien.
Frederick, thank you.
Ah, Batia
Thank
qui est
you.
là, oui.
Er hört uns sprechen.
Hello, Bernice.
Gracias, Frederick.
Hello.
Merci, Frederic.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you.
It's very nice.
Bravo, Papa.
Oh, Suzanne, we're going swimming. Yes.
Merci Frédéric.
Esther. Edwin and Esther, we are just under the place where there was a sukkah once and raining in England.
Did he say hi to you?
Hello, John and Bernice.
I'll be writing you in 2 seconds. You'll get an email.
Okay. Thank you all for participating.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Frederick. Amazing.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frederic. I was on mute.
Judy,
Jerusalem.
so nice to see you.
You know,
I was talking about you. I'll call you.
Frederic, Ralph is smiling at you. He's smiling.
Yes. My mother must be here.
I'm sure she is.
Bonnie, who has helped me so much through this journey, thank you. Thank you to all.
Bye, Frederick.
Amazing, Frederick. Amazing.
Thank you.